The Joint Intelligence and Rescue Operations Center at the Department of Justice had been operating under the highest security classification for 7 consecutive days, with Attorney General Pam Bondi coordinating what federal investigators described as the most extensive child trafficking rescue operation in American law enforcement history. The ultra-secure facility, protected by military-grade security systems and staffed around the clock by federal agents, intelligence analysts, child protection specialists, and medical personnel, hummed with the controlled urgency of professionals who had been working tirelessly to uncover and dismantle an MS-13 trafficking network that had systematically abducted, transported, and exploited hundreds of children across the United States, while operating with a level of organization and brutality that had shocked even veteran investigators who had devoted their careers to combating crimes against children. The Operations Center had been specially configured for this investigation, with over 400 workstations equipped with advanced analytical software that connected federal investigators to databases maintained by child protection agencies, international law enforcement organizations, and humanitarian groups across 6 continents. Real-time coordination systems provided continuous communication with field teams conducting rescue operations in 18 states, while specialized medical and psychological support teams stood ready to provide immediate care for rescued children who had endured trauma that required immediate intervention by professionals trained in treating victims of severe abuse and exploitation. The MS-13 child trafficking network, designated Operation Innocent Harvest by federal investigators, represented the most systematic and extensive child exploitation enterprise ever documented by American law enforcement agencies. Unlike traditional trafficking operations that focused primarily on sexual exploitation or forced labor, the MS-13 network had developed what investigators described as a comprehensive child exploitation system that included sexual trafficking, forced labor, drug trafficking recruitment, and even the use of children as human shields and weapons in gang operations, while maintaining operational security that had prevented detection by traditional child protection and law enforcement methods for over 4 years. The investigation had begun 11 months earlier when FBI Child Exploitation Task Force Specialist Dr. Lisa Rodriguez received a report from a hospital emergency room in Houston about a 13-year-old girl who had been brought in with injuries consistent with severe physical abuse and showed signs of prolonged sexual assault. The girl, who spoke only Spanish and appeared to be suffering from psychological trauma that prevented coherent communication, had been discovered by police during a routine traffic stop that had initially been focused on suspected drug trafficking activities rather than child exploitation. Dr. Rodriguez had spent 15 years investigating crimes against children, from individual cases of abuse to sophisticated trafficking networks that exploited vulnerable children through organized criminal enterprises. Her expertise in child trafficking had been developed through work with international organizations that combated child exploitation while providing specialized training in identifying and treating victims who had been subjected to trauma that often left them unable to communicate with investigators or seek help from law enforcement agencies. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Rodriguez, working with specialized interpreters and child psychologists, had successfully established communication with the victim that revealed she was one of dozens of children who had been systematically trafficked by MS-13 operatives across multiple states. The girl's testimony, gathered through months of careful psychological treatment and specialized interview techniques designed for severely traumatized children, had provided investigators with their first comprehensive understanding of the scope and sophistication of MS-13 child trafficking operations. FBI Crimes Against Children Division Director Marcus Thompson presented the intelligence assessment that had emerged from 11 months of investigation involving resources from across federal law enforcement, international child protection organizations, and specialized units that had been created specifically to combat organized child trafficking. Thompson had spent his career investigating crimes against children, but the MS-13 trafficking network represented something entirely new in criminal exploitation, a systematic approach to child trafficking that integrated multiple forms of exploitation while maintaining operational security that had allowed the network to operate across international borders and multiple jurisdictions without detection. "What we have uncovered is not traditional child trafficking," Thompson began, addressing the task force that included senior officials from FBI, ICE, DEA, and specialized child protection agencies. "This is a comprehensive criminal enterprise that has systematically trafficked hundreds of children while integrating multiple forms of exploitation, including sexual trafficking, forced labor, drug trafficking recruitment, and the use of children as operational assets in gang activities. The network represents a level of organization and brutality that exceeds anything we have previously documented in crimes against children investigations." The organizational structure revealed the unprecedented scope and sophistication of the MS-13 trafficking operation. At the leadership level was a command structure that included senior MS-13 members who had specialized in child trafficking operations while coordinating with other criminal enterprises that provided transportation, housing, and exploitation services that were essential to the trafficking network. The leadership had established formal operational procedures that governed every aspect of child trafficking, from initial recruitment through long-term exploitation, while maintaining security measures that had prevented law enforcement detection. The recruitment operations were controlled by Elena La Cazadora Martinez, an MS-13 associate who had specialized in identifying and abducting vulnerable children from communities across Central America and the southern United States. Martinez had developed systematic recruitment methods that targeted children from broken families, immigrant communities, and other vulnerable populations while using deception, coercion, and violence to gain control over victims who were then transported into the trafficking network. Martinez represented the most dangerous evolution of criminal recruitment tactics, an individual who had weaponized knowledge of vulnerable populations to identify and exploit children who were least likely to be missed by their communities or protected by law enforcement agencies. Her recruitment methods had been refined through years of operation while maintaining operational security that had prevented identification of her activities by child protection agencies. The transportation operations were managed by Carlos El Conducto Ramirez, a trafficking specialist who had established sophisticated networks for moving children across state and international borders while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. Ramirez had developed transportation methods that used legitimate businesses, corrupt transportation workers, and specialized routes that exploited gaps in border security and interstate law enforcement coordination. Ramirez's transportation network had been essential to the scope of MS-13 trafficking operations, allowing the network to move children across vast distances while maintaining operational security that prevented law enforcement tracking of trafficking routes and destinations. His expertise in avoiding detection had been developed through years of involvement in drug trafficking and human smuggling operations that had provided him with detailed knowledge of law enforcement interdiction methods and vulnerabilities. The exploitation operations were controlled by Dr. Ana Gutierrez, a former medical professional who had been stripped of her license for drug trafficking but had been recruited by MS-13 to provide medical services that kept trafficked children alive and functional while being subjected to extreme exploitation. Gutierrez had used her medical knowledge to develop methods for maintaining the health of trafficked children while ensuring they remained dependent on their traffickers for survival. Gutierrez's medical role in the trafficking network was particularly disturbing because it demonstrated how MS-13 had systematically addressed every aspect of child exploitation while ensuring the long-term viability of their criminal enterprise. Her involvement had allowed the network to maintain trafficked children in exploitative situations for extended periods while preventing deaths that might have attracted law enforcement attention to trafficking operations. The criminal activities conducted by the MS-13 network were diverse and systematic, representing capabilities that exceeded those of traditional trafficking organizations, while targeting children who were specifically chosen for their vulnerability and lack of protection by law enforcement or social services. Sexual exploitation operations included the trafficking of children for commercial sexual exploitation through networks that served clients across multiple states while maintaining operational security that prevented identification of exploitation locations and customer networks. The sexual trafficking operations were particularly sophisticated because they had been integrated with other MS-13 criminal activities in ways that provided multiple revenue streams while ensuring operational security through the gang's established criminal infrastructure. Children were trafficked not just for sexual exploitation, but also used as operational assets in drug trafficking and other criminal activities that maximize their exploitation while ensuring their continued dependence on the trafficking network. Forced labor operations included the exploitation of trafficked children in agricultural work, domestic servitude, and other labor activities that generated revenue for MS-13 while keeping children in conditions that prevented escape or communication with potential rescuers. The forced labor operations were integrated with legitimate businesses that provided cover for exploitation while maintaining plausible deniability about the use of trafficked children. Drug trafficking recruitment operations included the systematic recruitment of trafficked children into drug trafficking activities that served multiple purposes for MS-13, including revenue generation, operational security, and the creation of child criminals who were less likely to cooperate with law enforcement even if they were rescued from trafficking situations. The recruitment methods were designed to create psychological dependence that ensured continued loyalty to MS-13, even after children had been integrated into criminal activities. Human shield operations included the use of trafficked children as protection for MS-13 operatives during criminal activities, exploiting the reluctance of law enforcement agencies to use force in situations where children might be harmed. The human shield tactics were particularly disturbing because they weaponized child welfare concerns to provide operational advantages for adult criminals, while placing children in extreme danger during violent criminal activities. ICE Human Trafficking Division Director Sarah Martinez presented the international intelligence that revealed the scope of MS-13 trafficking operations that extended across multiple countries while exploiting gaps in international law enforcement coordination to maintain trafficking networks that operated with impunity across international borders. Martinez had spent her career investigating international trafficking networks, but the MS-13 operation represented a level of international coordination that challenged traditional approaches to combating transnational criminal organizations. The MS-13 trafficking network operates across multiple countries, including the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, Martinez reported, displaying maps that showed trafficking routes and operational bases that spanned the entire Central American region. The network exploits gaps in international law enforcement coordination while maintaining operational bases in countries where law enforcement capabilities are limited, and corruption allows criminal organizations to operate with minimal interference from government authorities. The international scope of trafficking operations had been essential to MS-13's ability to maintain large numbers of trafficked children while avoiding detection by any single law enforcement jurisdiction. Children were trafficked across international borders in ways that complicated investigation and prosecution while ensuring that victims were isolated from their home communities and support systems that might have provided protection or assistance. The recruitment operations conducted in Central American countries had targeted children from communities that were experiencing economic hardship, political instability, and limited government services that provided protection for vulnerable populations. The recruitment methods included deception about opportunities in the United States, along with direct abduction of children who were subsequently transported across international borders into trafficking networks. The corruption of government officials in multiple countries had been essential to MS-13's international operations, providing protection for trafficking routes while preventing effective law enforcement response to trafficking activities. The corruption included law enforcement officials, border security personnel, and even child protection workers who had been paid to ignore trafficking activities or provide information that helped traffickers avoid detection. The coordination with other international criminal organizations had expanded MS-13's trafficking capabilities while providing access to transportation networks, safe houses, and exploitation operations that exceeded what the gang could have developed independently. The coordination had created an international trafficking network that was more resilient and harder to disrupt than traditional trafficking operations that relied on single criminal organizations. DEA Gang Intelligence Division Director Jennifer Walsh presented the analysis of how child trafficking operations were integrated with MS-13's broader criminal activities, including drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and territorial control operations that used trafficked children as operational assets, while generating revenue that supported the gang's overall criminal enterprise. Walsh had spent her career investigating gang operations, but the integration of child trafficking with other criminal activities represented a new level of criminal sophistication that challenged traditional approaches to gang enforcement. MS-13 has systematically integrated child trafficking with their broader criminal operations, Walsh reported, displaying organizational charts that showed how trafficking activities supported and were supported by other MS-13 criminal enterprises. Trafficked children are used not just for sexual exploitation and forced labor, but also as operational assets in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and territorial control operations, while generating revenue that supports the gang's overall criminal activities. The integration makes child trafficking essential to MS-13's operational capabilities rather than just a source of additional revenue. The integration with drug trafficking operations included the use of trafficked children as drug couriers, lookouts, and operational security for drug trafficking activities, while ensuring that children were deeply involved in criminal activities that made them less likely to cooperate with law enforcement, even if they were identified as trafficking victims. The drug trafficking integration provided MS-13 with operational advantages, while ensuring continued control over trafficked children. The weapons trafficking integration included the use of trafficked children to transport and store weapons, while providing operational security for weapons trafficking activities. Children were used for weapons trafficking because their youth made them less likely to be suspected by law enforcement, while their vulnerability ensured loyalty to MS-13 through fear and dependence. The territorial control integration included the use of trafficked children as intelligence assets who could monitor community activities and report on law enforcement operations, while providing MS-13 with information that was essential to maintaining territorial control. Children were particularly effective intelligence assets because their presence in communities was less likely to attract attention, while their vulnerability ensured cooperation with MS-13 demands for information. The revenue generation from child trafficking had become essential to MS-13's overall financial operations, providing steady income that supported other criminal activities while ensuring that the gang had strong financial incentives to maintain and expand trafficking operations. The revenue integration had made child trafficking a core component of MS-13's criminal enterprise rather than a peripheral activity. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Director Michael Torres presented the victim identification and recovery analysis that revealed the scope of MS-13 trafficking victims while identifying the challenges involved in locating and rescuing children who had been trafficked through sophisticated networks that used multiple forms of exploitation. Torres had spent his career working with missing and exploited children, but the MS-13 network represented challenges that exceeded traditional child recovery operations due to the sophisticated security measures and multiple exploitation methods used by the trafficking network. We have identified over 300 children who have been trafficked by the MS-13 network, Torres reported, displaying victim identification data that showed the scope of trafficking operations while revealing the challenges involved in locating children who had been moved through multiple states and countries. The children range in age from 6 to 17 years old and include both American citizens and foreign nationals who have been trafficked for multiple forms of exploitation. The identification and recovery operations represent the most complex child rescue operation in American law enforcement history. The victim identification process had been complicated by MS-13's use of multiple identities for trafficked children, frequent movement of victims between exploitation locations, and the use of psychological manipulation that made children reluctant to identify themselves as victims or seek help from law enforcement agencies. Many children had been trafficked for extended periods and had been subjected to trauma that required specialized treatment before they could provide information that would assist in rescue operations. The age range of identified victims had included children as young as 6 years old who had been trafficked for forced labor and other forms of exploitation that did not require physical maturity. The trafficking of very young children had been particularly disturbing because it demonstrated MS-13's willingness to exploit the most vulnerable members of society while using methods that caused permanent psychological and physical damage to victims. The citizenship status of trafficked children had included both American citizens and foreign nationals, with many victims being children of immigrant families who were reluctant to contact law enforcement due to fears about their own immigration status. The immigration status complications had been exploited by MS-13 to maintain control over victims while preventing families from seeking help from authorities. The multiple forms of exploitation experienced by individual children had complicated victim identification and recovery because children had been trafficked for different purposes at different times while being moved between exploitation operations that required different forms of treatment and recovery services. Many children had experienced sexual exploitation, forced labor, and involvement in criminal activities that required comprehensive treatment approaches. Department of Justice Victim Services Division. Director Patricia Rodriguez presented the comprehensive victim support and recovery analysis that revealed the specialized services required for children who had been rescued from MS-13 trafficking operations, while identifying the long-term support requirements for victims who had experienced severe trauma and exploitation. Rodriguez had spent her career developing victim services programs, but the MS-13 trafficking survivors represented support requirements that exceeded traditional victim services capabilities due to the severity and complexity of trauma experienced by trafficking victims. The children rescued from MS-13 trafficking operations require comprehensive support services that address severe trauma while providing long-term assistance that will be necessary for successful recovery and reintegration, Rodriguez reported, displaying victim services assessments that showed the complex needs of trafficking survivors. The services required include immediate medical care, specialized psychological treatment, educational support, and long-term assistance with basic life skills that will allow these children to develop into healthy, productive adults. The support requirements exceed traditional victim services capabilities and require coordination with specialized organizations that have expertise in treating severe trauma. The immediate medical care requirements had included treatment for injuries caused by physical abuse, sexual assault, and neglect, while addressing medical conditions that had developed due to poor living conditions and lack of appropriate medical care during trafficking. Many children required extensive medical treatment before they could begin psychological recovery processes. The psychological treatment requirements had included specialized therapy for children who had experienced severe trauma, while developing treatment approaches that addressed the complex psychological damage caused by extended exploitation and abuse. The psychological treatment required specialists who had expertise in treating child trafficking victims while providing services that addressed both immediate trauma and long-term psychological development needs. The educational support requirements had included remedial education for children who had been denied educational opportunities during trafficking while providing specialized educational services that addressed learning difficulties that had developed as a result of trauma and exploitation. Many children required extensive educational support to achieve basic literacy and numeracy skills that would allow them to participate in normal educational programs. The life skills support requirements had included basic assistance with social skills, daily living activities, and community integration that would allow rescued children to function independently as adults. Many children had been trafficked from such young ages that they lacked basic knowledge about normal social interactions and daily living skills that most children develop through normal family and community experiences. Homeland Security Child Protection Division Director Robert Martinez presented the national security analysis that revealed how MS-13 child trafficking operations created broader security concerns that extended beyond traditional child protection issues to include national security implications that required coordination with intelligence agencies and homeland security organizations. Martinez had spent his career analyzing threats to homeland security, but the MS-13 trafficking network created security concerns related to border security, immigration enforcement, and the potential for exploitation by other criminal or terrorist organizations. The MS-13 child trafficking network creates national security implications that extend beyond traditional child protection concerns, Martinez reported, displaying security assessments that showed how trafficking operations affected broader homeland security issues. The network's international operations exploit vulnerabilities in border security while creating opportunities for other criminal organizations to use similar methods for smuggling personnel, weapons, or other materials that could threaten national security. The trafficking network also creates long-term security concerns related to the potential for trafficked children to be recruited by other criminal or terrorist organizations. The border security implications had included the exploitation of gaps in border security systems by trafficking networks that used similar methods to those that could be employed by terrorist organizations or foreign intelligence services seeking to infiltrate personnel into the United States. The trafficking operations had demonstrated vulnerabilities in border security that could be exploited by other organizations with more serious national security implications. The immigration enforcement implications had included the complexity of addressing trafficking victims who were foreign nationals while maintaining immigration enforcement priorities that were essential to border security. The trafficking cases had created challenges for immigration agencies that were required to balance child protection concerns with immigration enforcement responsibilities. The long-term security implications had included the potential for trafficked children to be recruited by other criminal organizations or to develop into adult criminals who posed ongoing security threats to American communities. The long-term impacts of trafficking required comprehensive support services that would prevent trafficked children from becoming adult criminals while addressing the social conditions that made children vulnerable to trafficking. The international coordination requirements had included working with foreign law enforcement agencies and international organizations to address trafficking networks that operated across multiple countries while pursuing diplomatic initiatives that would enhance international cooperation in combating child trafficking. The international coordination was essential to addressing the root causes of trafficking while preventing trafficking organizations from simply relocating operations to countries with weaker law enforcement capabilities. Bondi studied the victim assessments, intelligence reports, and security analyses that covered the walls of the operations center, each document representing the systematic documentation of crimes against children that challenged every assumption about the limits of criminal brutality, while revealing the extensive resources required to address trafficking networks that exploited the most vulnerable members of society. The scope of MS-13 child trafficking operations had created a crisis that required comprehensive federal response capabilities that exceeded traditional law enforcement methods. The MS-13 child trafficking network represents one of the most heinous crimes against children ever documented by American law enforcement, Bondi announced to the assembled task force. We are confronting a criminal enterprise that has systematically trafficked hundreds of children while subjecting them to forms of exploitation and abuse that shock the conscience of every decent American. This is not traditional organized crime. This is systematic torture and exploitation of children who represent the most vulnerable members of our society. We will not rest until every trafficked child has been rescued and every criminal involved in these operations has been brought to justice. The response strategy, designated Operation Guardian Angel, would involve the largest child trafficking rescue operation in American law enforcement history, requiring coordination between federal agencies, state child protection services, international partners, and specialized victim services organizations to rescue trafficked children while dismantling the criminal networks that had exploited them. Phase 1 would involve coordinated rescue operations in 18 states, with simultaneous raids on trafficking locations while prioritizing the safety and immediate care of rescued children. The rescue operations would be conducted by specialized teams that included federal agents, child protection specialists, medical personnel, and victim services coordinators who had expertise in dealing with severely traumatized children. Phase 2 would involve comprehensive investigation and prosecution of MS-13 members and associates involved in trafficking operations using all available federal authorities, including racketeering, trafficking, and child exploitation charges that would ensure lengthy prison sentences for individuals who had participated in trafficking operations. The prosecutions would be supported by victim services programs that would provide comprehensive support for child survivors who agreed to testify against their traffickers. Phase 3 would involve comprehensive asset forfeiture actions against properties, businesses, and financial assets that had been used to support trafficking operations while providing resources that could be used for victim services and long-term support for rescued children. The asset forfeiture would target both criminal proceeds and the infrastructure that had enabled trafficking operations. Phase 4 would involve comprehensive victim services operations that would provide immediate care and long-term support for rescued children, while ensuring that survivors receive the specialized treatment and assistance necessary for recovery and successful reintegration into society. The victim services would include medical care, psychological treatment, educational support, and long-term assistance with basic life skills development. Phase 5 would involve international cooperation with foreign law enforcement agencies and international organizations to address trafficking networks that operated across multiple countries, while pursuing diplomatic initiatives that would enhance international cooperation in combating child trafficking and addressing the root causes that made children vulnerable to trafficking. MS-13 believed they could exploit the most vulnerable children in our society, while using their brutality and operational security to prevent law enforcement from identifying and rescuing their victims, Bondi told the assembled task force. They calculated that their international operations and sophisticated security measures would allow them to continue trafficking children while avoiding the consequences of their crimes against innocent victims. She paused, studying the faces of the federal agents, child protection specialists, and victim services coordinators who would be executing the most comprehensive child rescue operation in American history. They underestimated the determination of American law enforcement and the resources we will deploy to protect children from criminal exploitation. Operation Guardian Angel will demonstrate that no criminal organization, regardless of its brutality or international scope, can successfully traffic children on American soil while expecting to avoid the full force of American justice. The task force briefing concluded with operational assignments that would mobilize over 2,000 federal agents, child protection specialists, medical personnel, and victim services coordinators in a coordinated response to rescue trafficked children while dismantling the criminal networks that had exploited them. The MS-13 trafficking network that had operated with apparent impunity for over 4 years would face the overwhelming response of American law enforcement agencies united in protection of the most vulnerable members of society. As the task force prepared for Operation Guardian Angel, Bondi remained in the operations center, studying the victim identification displays that showed the faces of hundreds of children who had been trafficked by MS-13 operations. Each photograph represented a child who had been subjected to exploitation and abuse that would require years of specialized treatment and support for recovery. But those children would no longer face their exploitation alone. Within 12 hours, Operation Guardian Angel would begin the largest child rescue operation in American law enforcement history, bringing the full resources of the federal government to bear in protection of trafficked children, while ensuring that their exploiters face justice for crimes that had shocked the conscience of the nation. The rescued children would learn that they were not forgotten, that American society would not tolerate their exploitation, and that Attorney General Pam Bondi's Justice Department would pursue their traffickers with relentless determination while providing them with every resource necessary for healing and recovery from the trauma they had endured.